Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Catherine Mattice here, founder and CEO of Civility Partners. We focus on building positive work environments. And today I am so honored to have Amazin Lethi here with me. She is a global LGBTQ advocate, athlete, published author, cultural change leader, and she's the only Asian LGBTQ athlete in the world to hold multiple LGBTQ sports ambassadors roles simultaneously. That's a mouthful. And she works with government, Fortune 500s, international organizations such as the Prince's Trust around equality and gender issues. And she was also a part of Team Biden's campaigns Out for Biden team. And, she's doing a lot of really cool things. So if you're not already following her, definitely do so. So Amazin, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah. So let's just jump right in. Your motto is to embrace each person's story, to be truly diverse and inclusive. Talk to me about that motto.
Sure. When I think of, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think of my own journey, but I also think of the power of storytelling and how it's a revolutionary act when you hear your story for the first time, but when you hear someone else's story for the first time, because when you hear a lived experience from someone else, you truly know then what it's like to live in that person's shoes. And then when you embrace that person's story, you can't only not just feel compassion, but then you truly understand, how do I make then my workplace or my community diverse and inclusive? Because once I hear your story, I understand where you're coming from, but then I know in terms of, particularly if I'm a business leader, what kind of policies do I need in place so everyone's at the table and everyone feels included.
How does an organization create space and safety for people to feel comfortable to share their stories?
I understand that, and I speak to so many organizations where, we're trying to create this safe space where people can share their stories, but people aren't coming forward. So it starts with leadership, leadership sharing their story and being vulnerable and open. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than having the CEO or someone from executive management in front of you sharing their vulnerability and sharing their journey and story as well, because then it starts to create a safe and nurturing environment where then you feel to share that's safe to start to share your story as well. And also, bringing external people in, like myself, because everyone needs to see themselves in terms of their own story.
Yeah. Tell me how you go into organizations and work with them. I'm curious to hear some of what you're up to.
Sure. It really started from my own journey from when I was a child, of being, bullied and feeling different and never seeing myself in society and on TV and in the workplace. And that journey that I went through of, struggling with my identity and my sexuality, and then that journey through the workplace as well, kind of led me to all this advocacy work. Because when you're from I have multiple identities, and we also have to have an intersectional approach. I'm a woman, I'm an Asian woman, plus I'm from the LGBTQ community, and I know what that feels like, being in the workplace and not being able to feel like you can share your story, and not seeing yourself in the workplace, and not seeing, particularly when you're LGBTQ, not seeing executive sponsors in the workplace. And I see companies struggle and organizations so deeply in terms of connecting and being able to reach out to ethnic minority groups, particularly the Asian community and the LGBTQ community. And, all that work led me to, this is a lived experience for me, of engaging with governments, Fortune 500 companies and entities. And what that looks like, my background is an athlete. So a lot of work that I do is how we can champion equality through the lens of sports, because sports are language that everyone understands. And I think business leaders now really understand that. One, I think particularly through the pandemic, we have to look after the mental health of our staff. And one of those ways is through their well-being and through social activities, through sports. Also, we understand that in terms of LGBTQ people feeling comfortable in being themselves and bringing their whole self to work, one of those ways is through the power of sports, as having that kind of social activity within the business environment, but also a way to connect with other LGBT groups or companies through the power of having team sports through different companies. So that's a lot of work that I do, but also those discussions around what does DEI look like when you're wanting to engage the Asian community, and what that looks like of being able to look through an Eastern lens, particularly with international multinationals that have offices in Asia, because that looks very different in terms of how you look at DEI in the East compared to the West, and the challenges that you face as well.
Okay, I love that. So you're intertwining sports and DEI work, because you're right, we do all speak the language of sports. It's one thing that the world has in common all across. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your story? You said that since storytelling is something that you're focused on, I'd love to hear a little bit about yours.
Sure. For me, I never set out to be an advocate, and I never set out to, sit in front of governments and work with the White House. It really came through, as I said, my own lived experience as a child of growing up in an all-white background, being constantly bullied for looking different, really struggling with my sexuality because I never saw anyone that looked like me. I didn't even know what the LGBTQ acronym was. I just knew inside that I felt different, and I knew that I just did not see that reflection in the world. I went into sports very early on to find a sense of community, but I found the bullying and racism followed me into sports, being the only Asian person stepping out onto the field and what that feels like. In my teenage years, I started competing competitively as a bodybuilder. I went into bodybuilding at 6, a very young age.
Yeah.
For a kid.
I didn't know they had bodybuilding for 6
You can't even get into the gym now at 6, but I went to a local gym owned by just someone in the neighborhood who didn't necessarily care how old you were, as long as you could pay, which I couldn't pay, but I just think he thought that she would only come once and then that was it. But I just kept on coming back. But that really thrust me into suddenly this male adult world that was very sexist and very misogynistic within bodybuilding. But then I learned very quickly how to move in a very male dominated world, which really set me up for being a female executive in the business sector now, because most spaces that I walk into are, cisgender white male, but I'm able to hold those spaces because that's a very lived experience for me as a kid and a young adult. In my teenage years, I competed competitively, but still very much struggled with my sexuality and never saw myself in sports and bodybuilding. Very early on, the Federation, let me know that there wasn't a place for LGBTQ people in sports. So I never thought I could come out ever. And then looking at the workplace and society, I never thought I could ever be openly out. And that's a very hard place to be. And for many LGBTQ people right now, this is their lived experience, that they go in, day out, and have to put on a fake story, and that difficulty inside of not bringing your whole self to work and how that impacts on your mental health and also, obviously your performance at work. As a young adult, I was homeless for a number of years, in and out of shelters, very suicidal, suffering from severe mental health. I truly believe that, for many of us, and I think within the pandemic, for many of us, we're one paycheck away from poverty and one person away from falling into the bad crowd. And, that for me became a whole part of my young adult years, but it really let me know what it was like to live on the margins of society and how difficult that was, and how exceptional I was in terms of my resilience to be able to pull myself out, because so few of us are able to pull themselves out of that kind of place. And it took me years, and I had a mental breakdown as I did it. But then afterwards, I looked through a completely different lens, and that really set me on the path to all the advocacy work that I do today, in terms of knowing what it was like not to see myself and the difficulties that so many LGBTQ people have in society, and particularly in the workplace. And it really just started in terms of me cold calling governments and asking them to share space for me to be able to share my story with different governments around the world, so they can truly understand what different parts of their community were going through, and in terms of thinking how to create policy change. And that obviously led me to all the work that I do today with sports organizations, the Olympics, Fortune 500 companies, and the White House.
Wow, that's quite a story. That is
in a nutshell. Yes.
I'm like, just keep talking. Wow, you've been through a lot, and to get all the way up to working with Biden, and I saw on your website you have a picture with him, and that's so cool. That's a very cool story. Very cool story. Do you think that we're moving in the right direction in terms of people feeling comfortable to share their stories at work? Or do you feel like we've got, years and years of work to do? Where are we on the timeline?
I think the pandemic gave us a moment to pause, because we started to end up in this completely different environment. And then with the rise of the BLM movement over the last year and the Stop Asian Hate, so many companies had to pivot very quickly in terms of, one, what was the messaging that they were going to say? What kind of statements they were going to put out in the world? And to really reflect on DEI within their own workplace, knowing that they had members from the Black and Asian and LGBTQ community as part of their workforce, as part of their customer and client base. I've truly seen this shift during the pandemic. I think we have, created a shift, and I think many people now realize that their lone voice can make a difference. But obviously we still have a long way to go, because, I still don't see the out leadership that we should see. We still don't see enough women in executive management. I still walk into boardrooms and I see all white men in those boardrooms. Companies still have a challenge when it comes to looking through an Eastern lens of how they can better support their Asian staff. But look, we're definitely on the right track, and I meet so many organizations that just want to make their start and want to hold space and listen as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of organizations are sort of scared because they don't know what the first step is, and they're afraid to misstep. And so I think you just got to start trying stuff out, or talking to people like you to get some information about how to start moving in that direction. We focus on building positive work environments where people feel like they can be their whole selves, and where they feel like they're thriving. And so a big part of that is certainly allyship and bystander intervention, where, any sort of negative behavior that one witnesses, I think we should feel comfortable to step in and say, hey, that joke that you made yesterday, don't make that again, and I'm just curious about, you obviously talk a lot about allyship as well. So allyship in action, talk to me about that.
I do a lot of talking around allyship in action, because I just know what it feels like when I had entered into the workplace and people have said something to me and no one stood up. And I thought, I would have some kind of support. And I think, we all must be an ally in action, and it should become embedded and a thread and the fabric of who we are as people. many of us say, well, I'm an advocate. And yes, you can be many people say I can be an ally. And it's great to wear the rainbow pin, to wear the trans pin, to wear the BLM pin. But there's a difference between wearing the pin and then being an advocate and raising your voice and championing me when I'm not in the room, because so much of what happens is when that person isn't in the room, and how you stand up in that moment and call it out, but also making it a learning experience for that other person. And they're just very small things you can do. Yeah. Like for the LGBTQ community, do you have policies in place? Do you have trans policies in place? Do you have gender neutral toilets? Are you, sharing pride with your staff? Do you have ERG groups? Are you wearing the rainbow pin? It's not just for June in Pride. It's, for 365 days of the year. And, equality benefits everyone. It's not just a special right for one community. It's a right for all communities. And I think when you're thinking of these policies in your workplace, think of who is in your workplace that could be at the table to help you shape and mold these policies. Bring the community with you as part of the change, and as part of, understanding what kind of policies should be in place to affect their community and how you can better support them. And I always, I do get it a lot from organizations that say, well, where do we start? We don't want to make mistakes. This could be really expensive. We think we only have 5 LGBTQ people in the company. That's going to be very expensive to change all these policies. And I think you're not inventing the wheel, because there are organizations ahead of you that you can go to for advice of looking at their policies, because it could be just a tweak of a sentence. And I think, companies need to form, and so many organizations do that. The DEI leader is part of a collective of other companies that they meet, virtually or in person once a month or fortnightly, where they can then, chat to other leaders about, best practices and what they're doing. So, the information is out there, but it's important to start where you are and to make that start.
Yeah, there is lots of information out there. So I think that's maybe was once an excuse. I don't know where to start, but it's not anymore, because there's lots of resources out there. You talked a bit about well-being and DEI and bringing your whole self. Do you feel like something like a well-being program and a DEI program should be intertwined? I feel like I see organizations that are like, we have our DEI initiative over here, and then there's the well-being initiative over here. But I feel like maybe they're not different initiatives. They're meant to go to, I don't know. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
They're meant to be together, because when you think of diversity, equity, inclusion, you think of someone like myself. And then you think, well, I need to shape a well-being program to support someone like myself. So they go together, and you have to have those communities at the table as well, because well-being may look very differently for you compared to what it looks like for me, as well as a Asian queer woman. I experience many different things walking into the workplace compared to a cisgender white person. In the workplace. So we really need to, and I think as well, the pandemic has shown us that everyone suffers from mental health in very different capacities. And, being isolated and not at work, many companies are now going virtual. But what does that mean for that staff member who never has access to human contact and sits on a Zoom call, 24/7? And what that means for someone's well-being and mental health.
Yeah, I like your answer, because I think if you're going to say we have a well-being program and the focus is to help people feel as well as they can, that somebody who feels like they have to hide part of themselves when they're at work, they're never going to reach that goal of thriving and having the well-being. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And I know COVID impacted different communities in different ways. And so we've got to get outside of ourselves and learn about what are the ways that others were impacted. I definitely really appreciate everything you're saying. Any final words for a manager or a leader who's watching now, to kind of final advice to them?
I think one, make sure you're embracing each person's story, because when you're thinking of creating policies, you need to embrace that person's story. Two, I think we really need to start looking at our staff's well-being and mental health and putting that priority first, and thinking very different in terms of how we work. We need to have flexible working hours. I truly believe we should be going down to a 4-day week instead of a 5-day week. We can get so much more done on a 4-day week. People should be able to have time off when they need them. So, mental health breaks, very important. And, making sure that everyone is at the table. And also, I believe in the power of reverse mentoring. I think that's so powerful for executives to receive reverse mentoring within the workplace as well.
I love that. Tell me more about that. How do you set up a program like that? Talk to me more about that.
I mean, I think that the wonderful thing of when I think of, I remember speaking with one organization, and the CEO said, I'm a cisgender white man, and how much would reverse mentoring would work so well for me, because if you were in my company, Amazin, I would then be able to learn from an Asian queer female, and be able to embrace your story and learn from that, which would obviously help in terms of policy change down the track, and a better understanding of the employees within your workforce. Because at the end of the day, if you have employees that are happy, are thriving, feel like they have worth and value in the workplace, feel like they can bring their whole self, that you're embracing their story, at the end of the day, it affects your bottom line. It really comes down to your bottom line in terms of, having a workplace that thrives, and, staff that, want to stay at your company. Because you think of, new recruits and graduates, they're looking at longevity, and they're looking at who's in the company, how long they've been there. If there's a very high turnover, they'll go to the next company. So there's so much power in reverse mentoring, and it comes down to embrace, my motto of embracing each person's story to make it, a diverse and inclusive environment.
Yeah, what a great way to say we care about your voice, and we want to understand your story, because my story is very different than yours as a white female. I just love all this work, and I'm looking forward to seeing how society morphs over time and how workplaces morph over time. And I agree, we've got to keep flexible work in place. I think at least the silver lining of COVID is maybe we got a little more vulnerable at work, whereas before, you're not supposed to cry at work, you're not supposed to be vulnerable, you're supposed to have a certain kind of facade. And I really think that COVID's broken that a little bit. And I think that's a good thing. So what a crazy couple years, but also a perfect storm for good to come out on the other side. So anyway, well, thank you so much again for being here with me, Amazin. And I'll post your website in the chat so people viewing later can visit your website. And Amazin does speaking and keynoting and working with organizations. So check her out. And thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.